The crystal flute trembled in his hand when he finally understood what I'd brought to my daughter's wedding. 42 years I'd carried that brown envelope, tucked between the pages of a King James Bible nobody in our family had cracked open since my mother passed in 1989. 42 years of biting my tongue at the grocery store in Sault Ste. Marie when his face appeared on the cover of the business section. 42 years of watching my daughter grow up not knowing why I flinched every time someone mentioned the Algoma Steel expansion. And there I stood, 67 years old, in a cream-colored dress I'd bought at Reitman's for $119, watching my son-in-law's father go pale beneath 300 pairs of staring eyes at the Fairmont Royal York in Toronto. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's what my late husband used to say when I told a story. "Slow down, Marjorie," he'd say. "You're skipping the good part." So let me start where it actually started. I was 19 when I married Henry Droyard in the spring of 1978. We got married at Sacred Heart in Wawa, Ontario, a town most people only know from the giant goose statue on the highway. My father walked me down the aisle in a borrowed suit because we didn't have money for a new one, and my mother cried into a handkerchief that had belonged to her own grandmother, who came over from Galway during the famine. Henry was 23, 6'2", with hands the size of dinner plates, and a laugh you could hear from the other end of the rink. He worked underground at the iron ore mine just outside town, the way his father had, and his father before him. I want you to understand something about Henry. He wasn't a poet. He wasn't a romantic in the way people mean it now. But every Friday after his shift, no matter how exhausted he was, he'd stop at the corner store and buy me a single carnation. Not roses, because roses were what men bought when they'd done something wrong. Carnations were what you brought home to a wife you genuinely liked being married to. That's the kind of man he was. We had our daughter Bridget in the autumn of 1981. She came 3 weeks early and spent her first 11 days in an incubator at the hospital in Sault Ste. Marie and Henry drove the 2 hours each way every single night after his shift to press his hand against the glass. The nurses started leaving him a coffee on a little stool by the incubator. That's the kind of place Northern Ontario was then. People knew you. People made room. Henry died on March 17, 1983. St. Patrick's Day. Bridget was a year and a half old. The official report said it was an accident. A roof collapse in the lower drift caused by what the company called unforeseeable geological conditions. 3 men died that day. Henry, a fellow named Pierre Tremblay, who'd just become a grandfather 2 weeks earlier, and a young apprentice named Daryl, whose mother I'd gone to high school with. The company sent each widow a check for $18,000 and a letter typed on letterhead so thick you could have used it as a coaster. I should have signed it. Most of the other widows did. Pierre's wife took the money and moved to Sudbury to live near her sister. Daryl's mother put it toward his headstone and his younger brother's college, and she never spoke of the mine again. But 2 weeks after Henry's funeral, a man knocked on my door. He was wearing a parka with the company logo stitched on the chest, and his hands were shaking so badly he kept dropping his cigarette. He said his name was Roland Cheevers, and he'd been Henry's shift supervisor that morning. He said he had 4 kids and he couldn't sleep. He said the Geological Survey had warned them 3 weeks earlier that the lower drift wasn't safe. He said the mine manager, a man named Vernon Kessel, had ordered them to keep working anyway because the quarterly numbers were short. He said Henry had been the one to ask that morning whether they should send someone up to check the timbers, and Vernon Kessel had told him on the radio to stop being a coward and do his job. Roland Cheevers gave me an envelope. Inside the envelope was a photocopy of the geological report, with Vernon Kessel's signature dismissing it. There was also a handwritten log from the radio room. Roland's own handwriting recording the exchange word for word. Henry's last words on company time were, "I just want to make sure my crew goes home tonight." Roland Cheevers told me he was leaving for Alberta in the morning. He said he was sorry. He said if I tried to use the documents, the company would bury me. He said they had lawyers in Toronto who ate widows for breakfast. But he said he couldn't carry it anymore, and somebody should know. I want to tell you that I marched down to the Wawa OPP detachment the next morning and slammed those papers on the desk. I want to tell you I was brave. But I was 24 years old. I had a baby in a crib who couldn't yet say mama properly. I had $342 in a checking account at the Bank of Nova Scotia. My parents were both dead by then, and Henry's mother was in a wheelchair from MS. If I lost, and Roland was right, I would have lost. Bridget would have ended up in the system. I'd seen it happen to a girl I'd gone to school with, so I cashed the $18,000 check. I put the envelope in the Bible. I moved Bridget and me to Sault Ste. Marie and I got a job as a receptionist at a chiropractic clinic, and I never told anyone what I knew. Vernon Kessel went on to become president of the parent corporation in 1991. By the time Bridget was finishing high school, he was being interviewed in the Globe and Mail about Canadian mining innovation. By the time she finished her social work degree at Lakehead University, he had a wing of the Royal Ontario Museum named after him. I would see his face in waiting rooms and at the Tim Hortons and on the cover of Maclean's, and every single time I would think of Henry's hand pressed against the glass of an incubator at 2 a.m. I raised Bridget on a receptionist salary and the $18,000 I never spent. I worked weekends doing books for a man who owned 3 pizza shops. I refinished other people's furniture in our garage and sold it at a flea market on Saturdays. Bridget and I lived in a 2-bedroom rental on Wellington Street East with a landlord who only raised the rent twice in 22 years because, as he put it, he liked having a quiet tenant who paid on the first. Bridget grew up to be a serious girl, a kind girl with her father's laugh and my stubbornness. She put herself through Lakehead with student loans and summer jobs at a tree planting outfit in northwestern Ontario. She didn't ask me for money because she knew I didn't have it. After she graduated, she got a job with Children's Aid in Toronto, and 3 years later she met a man at a benefit dinner for a literacy charity. His name was Hayden Kessel. Bridget called me the night they got engaged. She was 36. He was 38. They'd been together 2.5 years, and I knew his name from her phone calls, but I'd never asked his last name because Bridget mentioned him as Hayden, and I assumed she'd tell me the rest in time. When she said Kessel, my throat closed. I asked her what his father did. She said her future father-in-law was retired now, but he'd been an executive in mining for most of his career. A philanthropist. A wonderful man, she said. She'd had dinner with him twice, and he'd been so warm to her. He'd asked all about her work with the kids. He'd asked about me. Hayden's mother had passed away from breast cancer 8 years earlier, and Bridget called him Vernon, casually, the way you call any older man you're getting to know, had told her he was looking forward to meeting me at the engagement dinner. I held the phone to my ear, and I looked at the Bible on my bookshelf, and I made a decision that I have spent every day since regretting and not regretting in equal measure. I didn't tell her. I told myself 100 reasons. She loved him. He wasn't his father. She was 36, and she'd waited so long for someone good. The wedding was 11 months away. There was time. The documents were 40 years old. What could they really do now? Vernon Kessel was 81. Maybe the right thing was to let it go, to let Bridget have her happiness, to let the grave hold what the grave already held. But I think the real reason, the one I didn't admit to myself until much later, was that I was a coward in 1983, and I was still a coward in 2025. The shape of the cowardice had changed. That was all. I met Vernon Kessel for the first time at the engagement dinner at a steakhouse on King Street. He was thinner than he'd looked in photographs, with white hair brushed back from a high forehead, and he wore a navy suit that probably cost more than my car. He stood when I came to the table. He took both my hands and he said, "Marjorie, I have been so looking forward to this." He said my name like he practiced it. He said Bridget was the daughter he'd never had. He told a story about Hayden as a little boy that made everyone at the table laugh. And Bridget looked at me across the table with shining eyes because she wanted me to love him, and I smiled, and I said all the right things. He didn't recognize my name. Why would he? 3 men died in his lower drift on March 17, 1983, and I was just one of 3 widows he'd never met. To him, I was probably the woman who'd cashed the check. For 11 months, I went to dress fittings and venue tours. I helped Bridget pick out invitations on heavy cardstock. I sat in a salon on Bloor Street while a woman with a clipboard talked about signature cocktails and seasonal florals, and Vernon Kessel paid for all of it because Hayden had told Bridget that his father insisted that this was his gift to the family. I let him pay. I hated myself for letting him pay, but I also took the brown envelope out of the Bible one Sunday afternoon in July, and I made copies, 3 sets. One I put back in the Bible, one I gave to a lawyer in Toronto named Lorraine. I'd looked her up because she'd represented mining widows in Elliott Lake in the 90s, and one I kept in the lining of my purse for the rest of the summer. Lorraine read the documents and she went very, very quiet. Then she said, "Marjorie, this is enough to reopen the inquest." 3 deaths. Documented foreknowledge. He could face criminal negligence charges. Even at his age, she said it would be ugly. She said the Kessel family had money and lawyers and would fight hard. She asked me what I wanted. I told her I didn't know yet. She said, "Tell me when you do. I'll be ready." The wedding was on the 2nd Saturday of October at the Fairmont Royal York. 300 guests. Bridget wore a dress with long sleeves and a high collar because that was the kind of woman she was. Hayden cried during his vows. I cried too, sitting in the front row in my cream-colored dress, holding a clutch with the brown envelope inside it, because my daughter looked so much like Henry in that moment that I almost couldn't breathe. The reception was in the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers, a jazz quartet, tables of people I didn't know, Hayden's colleagues from his investment firm, Vernon's friends from boards and clubs. Bridget had insisted I sit at the head table, even though Vernon's people had originally placed me at table 7, and I hadn't fought it because Bridget had fought it for me. Vernon Kessel rose to give the father of the groom toast around 8:30 in the evening. He had a microphone and a glass of champagne, and he spoke about Hayden for a long time, all the right things, the kind of speech that makes wedding videos. And then he turned toward me. He said, "I'd like to say a word about Bridget's mother. Marjorie has done, well, she's done what she could. Single mothers carry a heavy load, and not every woman could give a daughter the polish my Bridget has. I want Marjorie to know that from tonight on, she's part of the Kessel family. She doesn't have to worry anymore. We'll take care of her." He raised his glass. The room raised theirs. He did not mean to be cruel. I want to be honest about that. He genuinely thought he was being generous. He thought he was the magnanimous man taking the impoverished single mother from Northern Ontario into the embrace of his civilized world. He thought I should be grateful. The slight wasn't in his words. The slight was in everything underneath them, the assumption that my life had been a problem he was solving, that my daughter was a project that had needed his polish, that Henry's death had simply been the reason I was poor. I sat there in my cream dress and I felt something break open inside me. Not anger exactly, something older than anger, something I'd been holding shut since 1983. I stood up. Bridget looked at me with confusion. Hayden half rose to help me, the way you help an older woman who might be unsteady. I waved him down. I asked the band leader if I could borrow the microphone for a moment. He handed it over without thinking. I said, "Mr. Kessel, before I sit down, I want to ask you something. Do you remember the 17th of March, 1983? The room was still buzzing. He smiled the way an older man smiles at a question he hasn't quite heard. I said, "It was a Thursday. There was a roof collapse in the lower drift at the Algoma operation. 3 men died. One of them was named Henry Drouar. He was 28. He left behind a wife and a baby girl. He was 28. He left behind a wife and a baby girl." I watched his face. The smile slipped off it like a cloth sliding off a table. I said, "I'm Henry's wife. I was Henry's wife. The baby girl is the woman who just married your son." The buzz died. 300 people understood that something was happening, even if they didn't yet know what. I said, "I have something here I'd like everyone to see. I'd like you in particular to see, Mr. Kessel." I opened the clutch. I took out the envelope. I walked slowly because my hip has been bad since the winter of 2019, around the head table to where he was standing. I held it out to him. He didn't take it. I said loud enough for the microphone to catch it. This is the Geological Survey from February 24th, 1983. It warned that the timbers in the lower drift were compromised. It is signed and dated. Underneath that is a transcript of the radio exchange on the morning of the collapse. My husband asked you to send a crew up to check the timbers. You told him to stop being a coward. 12 minutes later, he was dead. So were Pierre Tremblay and Darrell Whitcomb. I said, I have been carrying these documents for 42 years. I have given a copy to a lawyer named Lorraine who is, I believe, very ready to file. I want everyone in this room to know what kind of man stood up tonight and offered to take care of me. There was no sound. I have never been in a room of 300 people and heard no sound. The jazz quartet had stopped playing. A waiter with a tray of empty glasses had frozen in the doorway. Vernon Kessel reached for the back of his chair and missed. His son Hayden caught him under the arm. Hayden's face. I will remember Hayden's face for the rest of my life. He was looking at his father the way a child looks at a stranger. Bridget was looking at me. I want to tell you what was in her face, but I'm not sure I have the right words. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't anger. It was something more like recognition. Like she was finally seeing a picture that had been hanging in our hallway her whole life, and she was understanding for the first time what was in it. I went back to my seat. I sat down. I put my hands flat on the white tablecloth so they would stop shaking. Vernon Kessel was helped from the room by two men I didn't know. The wedding planner, a woman named Audra with a headset, made a brisk announcement that the reception would continue, and somehow it did in a stunned and quiet way for another hour. Bridget danced with Hayden once. She didn't look at me during the dance. Then she came to my table and she sat down beside me and she took my hand and she said, Mom, you should have told me. I said, I know. I said, I know. I'm sorry. She said, Why didn't you tell me? I said, Because I was afraid you would still love him, and then I would have lost both of you. She held my hand for a long time. She didn't say anything else. Now? I have been told by a woman in my reading group in the Sioux that this is where the story should end. Triumph. Reckoning. The villain unmasked. She said you have to know when to stop a story, but life doesn't stop. The next 2 months were the hardest of my life since the spring of 1983. Bridget did not speak to me for 63 days. I kept count. I called every Sunday. She didn't answer. I texted on her birthday in November, and she sent back a single word, thanks. Hayden called me once from a hotel room in Vancouver where they'd gone for a sort of half-hearted honeymoon. He told me his father had been charged. He told me his mother, Vernon's late wife, had apparently known about the report for years and had drunk herself toward the cancer that killed her. He told me Bridget was in pieces. He told me he wasn't angry with me. He said he understood. He said he just needed me to give her time. I gave her time. I cleaned my apartment 3 times in November. I drove up to Wawa one cold afternoon and stood at Henry's grave for an hour. I told him what I had done. I told him I was sorry it had taken so long. I told him our daughter had grown up to look like him and that I hoped he would have been proud of how she carried herself in that ballroom, the way she'd held my hand at the table without ever letting go. I drove home in the dark and I made a pot of tea and I waited. Bridget called me on the 2nd Sunday of January. She said, Mom, I'm pregnant. I found out on Friday. She said, I want my child to know its grandmother. I'm still angry, but I want you here. I cried so hard I had to sit down on the kitchen floor. She came up to Sault Ste. Marie in February. She stayed 3 nights. We talked the way we hadn't talked since she was 16, about Henry, about the years after he died, about the brown envelope, about why I'd let Vernon pay for the wedding when I knew, about the shape of the silence I'd made her grow up inside. She asked hard questions. I gave her the truest answers I could. She told me Hayden had moved out of his father's foundation. He'd taken a job at a smaller firm. He didn't want any of the money. They had bought a smaller house in East York. They were going to be all right. The criminal case against Vernon Kessel was settled out of court in March with an enormous settlement to the families of the 3 dead miners. Pierre Tremblay's grandchildren were notified, and Daryl Whitcomb's mother, 86 years old, in a long-term care home in North Bay, was visited by Lorraine and her grandson, who held her hand while Lorraine explained what had happened. She took my number and called me 3 weeks later. We talked for 2 hours. She said, "I always knew. I just couldn't prove it." She said, "Thank you for proving it." Vernon Kessel was given a suspended sentence due to his age and health. He died of a stroke 7 months later. I felt nothing when I heard. That surprised me. My granddaughter was born in August. Bridget named her Henrietta. She is 2 now. She has Henry's laugh. I take her to the Tim Hortons in our neighborhood every Saturday morning for a sour cream glazed and a small carton of milk, and the woman behind the counter knows our order by heart, and Henrietta calls me Nan. Not Grandma. Nan! Bridget says it's because she heard Hayden's mother's mother used to be called that, and the word stuck. I want to tell you, if you're listening to this, if you're a woman my age, sitting alone in a kitchen in Trois Rivières or Brandon or Charlottetown, holding a piece of paper or a memory you've been carrying for 40 years, I want to tell you that I waited too long. I want to tell you the cost of waiting was 63 days of silence from my daughter and a granddaughter who almost wasn't, and 3 families who suffered for 4 decades when they could have had peace much sooner. But I also want to tell you that it is never too late. Henry kept a stub of a yellow carpenter's pencil in the breast pocket of his work shirt. After he died, the company sent me back his clothes in a cardboard box, and that pencil was in the pocket. I have kept it in a small wooden box on my dresser ever since. The day before the wedding, I took the pencil out and I wrote 1 word on a piece of paper. I tucked the paper into the envelope behind the geological survey. Vernon Kessel never saw it because he never opened the envelope. The word was enough. Henrietta found the pencil last week. She held it up in her small fist and she said, "Nan, what's this?" I said, "That belonged to your grandfather. He was a brave man. He used it to write down things that were important." She nodded the way a 2-year-old nods when she's pretending to understand. She handed it back to me. She said, "Okay, Nan," and she went back to playing on the rug. That's the whole story. Or as much of it as I know how to tell. I think about that brown envelope often, even now with Henrietta asleep in the next room and the kettle ticking on my counter in the Sioux. I think about the woman I was in 1983, 24 years old, holding a baby on one hip and a check for $18,000 in the other hand, and I want to reach back through the years and tell her something. Not that she was wrong. She wasn't wrong exactly. She was afraid, and the fear had reasons, and the reasons were real. But I would tell her this: every year you wait, the silence gets heavier, and the people who poured the silence into your hands keep walking around in expensive coats, naming wings of museums after themselves, while you carry the weight alone. What I learned, sitting at that head table at the Royal York with my hands flat on the white linen, is that cowardice and patience can wear the same dress for 40 years before you finally tell them apart. I had told myself I was being patient. I was being protective. I was waiting for the right time. But there is no right time for a thing like that. There is only the time you finally find the courage, and every other time before it. The cause of what happened to Bridget and me. The 63 days of silence, the missed phone calls, the granddaughter I almost didn't get to meet, was not what Vernon Kessel did at the wedding. He was only the match. The fuel was 42 years of my own held breath. If I had gone to that OPP detachment in 1983, even knowing what it would cost, my daughter would have grown up knowing who her father was and what he stood for. She would not have had to learn it as an adult in front of 300 people from a mother she suddenly didn't recognize. And yet, I do not want any woman listening to this to mistake my regret for self-punishment. 1983 was a different country. A working-class widow with a baby did not march into a corporate fortress and win. She survived. Survival is not nothing. Survival is what allowed me to be standing there, 4 decades later, with the documents still legible, with a lawyer named Lorraine on my side, with a daughter strong enough to take my hand at that table and not let go. So if you are sitting in your kitchen in Moncton or Lethbridge or Yellowknife holding something heavy you have carried too long, I will not tell you it is easy. I will tell you that strength built quietly over 40 years is still strength. I will tell you that your daughter or your son or your friend can hold what you tell them. They are stronger than you think, and so are you. And I will tell you that the small wooden box on a dresser with a yellow carpenter's pencil inside it is not a memorial. It is a reminder. Henry used that pencil to write down things that mattered. The pencil is still here. So am I. So finally is the truth. The bells were still ringing when my legs gave out. That's the part I remember clearest, even now. Not the pain, though there was pain. Not the falling, though I felt myself going down like a sack of flour someone had dropped from a great height. Just the bells. St. Mary's has the loveliest set of bells in all of Kingston, and they were ringing for the 11 o'clock service. And I remember thinking, isn't that nice? Isn't that just lovely? And then the floor of the vestibule came up to meet me, and everything went quiet. I'm 71 years old. I've buried a husband and a brother and 3 good dogs. I've lived through 2 miscarriages and 1 bankruptcy and that god-awful winter of 1998 when the ice storm took out our power for 14 days. I thought I'd seen the worst of what life could throw at me. I was wrong. The worst was still coming, and it wasn't going to come from a stranger or a storm or any of the usual villains. It was going to come from the one person on this earth I'd given my whole heart to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. My name is Constance Pemberton Whitlow, but everyone has always just called me Connie, and I grew up in a little township outside of Kingston, Ontario, where the limestone houses still stand from the 1840s and the maples turn the color of fire every October. I married my Walter when I was 23, and we built a life together that was nothing fancy but was ours. He was an electrician with the union, and I taught grade 4 at Calvin Park Public School for 36 years. We had 1 daughter, Marigold. 1. Just the 1. After her, my body was finished with babies, and we made our peace with it, because Marigold was enough for any 2 people. She was a bright, laughing thing, all golden curls and questions, and I used to look at her sleeping at night and feel something so big in my chest, I thought it would break me open. Walter died of a heart attack in our kitchen in March of 2019. He was holding a tea towel. He was 67. Marigold was 38 by then and living out in Calgary with her husband Trent and their boy, our grandson Bowden. She flew home for the funeral and stayed 4 days. She told me she couldn't take more time off from her job at the marketing firm. She told me Trent needed her. She told me Bowden had a hockey tournament. I told her, of course, sweetheart, of course. You go on home, Mom will be all right. That was the first lie I told myself about my daughter, but it wasn't the last. After Walter passed, I sold the house. It was too big for one person, and the stairs were getting hard on my hip, and I didn't want Marigold to have to deal with all that limestone and the half-acre of garden when I was gone. I bought a 1-bedroom condo in a building called the Cataraqui Arms, right downtown near the water, and I put the rest of the money, about $340,000 after the realtor and the lawyers had their bite, into a high-interest savings account at TD. That was going to be Marigold's eventually. That and the registered retirement income fund Walter had left me, and a smaller TFSA I built up over the years from teaching. All of it, every cent, was meant for her and for Bowden. She knew this. I'd told her. Walter and I had told her together before he died. I didn't know yet that she'd been counting. It was the 3rd Sunday in September when I collapsed. I'd been having little flutters in my chest for weeks, and a feeling like I'd run up a flight of stairs even when I was just standing still, rinsing dishes. But I put it down to the change of seasons and to that mild summer cold that had been hanging on. I went to church the way I'd been going since I was a girl in patent shoes. I sat in my usual pew, third from the front on the left side, and I sang the opening hymn, and then I stood up for the gospel reading, and the world tilted sideways, and I went down. I came back to myself for just a moment, a flickering moment, with the carpet against my cheek, and Reverend Tomlinson's face above me, looking like all the blood had drained out of it. Then I was gone again. When I woke up properly, I was in the cardiac care unit at Kingston General Hospital, and 3 days had vanished out of my life like they'd never existed. The first face I saw wasn't Marigold's. It was a young woman I didn't know, sitting in the visitor chair with a paperback book open in her lap. She had the kindest face, long brown hair pulled back in a clip, no makeup, a hospital cafeteria coffee cup beside her on the little wheelie table. When she saw my eyes open, she set the book down so carefully, like she didn't want to startle me with the sound of it. "Mrs. Pemberton Whitlow," she said. "Oh, thank goodness. Hi, my name is Romilly. I'm a friend of Reverend Tomlinson's. I've been sitting with you. Don't try to talk, all right? I'm going to get the nurse." I tried to talk anyway. My mouth made a sound that wasn't a word. "It's all right," she said. "It's all right. You've had a heart attack. They put a stent in. You've been here 3 days. You're going to be all right." 3 days. And the woman in the chair beside me was a stranger. The nurse came, and then the doctor, and there was a flurry of checking things and asking me questions and shining lights in my eyes, and through all of it, my mouth kept trying to make the same word. It took me a long time to get it out. "Daughter," I said. "My daughter." The doctor was a small Filipino woman with very tired eyes. She glanced at Romilly, and Romilly looked down at her paperback. The doctor turned back to me. "Mrs. Pemberton Whitlow," she said gently, "we've been trying to reach your daughter. The contact number you had listed. We've called 63 times over the last 3 days. She hasn't answered. She hasn't returned any messages. We left voicemails explaining the situation. 63 times. I lay there, and I felt something in me start to come apart. Not my heart this time. They'd patched my heart up with a little metal mesh and stopped that disaster. But something else, something that didn't have a name. "There must be a mistake," I said. My voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. She would have come. She would have flown out. There must be a mistake. The doctor didn't argue with me. She just patted my hand and told me to rest. It was Romilly who told me the truth. 2 hours later, when the doctor had gone and the nurses had finished their poking, she was still there. She'd been there the whole time, she said. Reverend Tomlinson had given her my emergency contact card from the parish records, and she'd been the one trying to call Marigold alongside the hospital. She'd called 21 times herself. She'd left a message that said, "Your mother is dying, please call back." She'd left another that said, "She's in surgery, please call back." She'd left a third that said she might not make it through the night. Nothing. Not a word. "I didn't want you to wake up alone," Romilly said. She was crying a little and trying to hide it. "Reverend said someone should be here. I don't have anywhere I need to be. My husband passed last spring and the kids are grown. So I just sat. I hope that's all right." I took her hand. It was the warmest thing I'd touched in a long time. "Sweetheart," I said, "it's more than all right." The phone, when they finally brought me my purse, told the rest of the story. There were no missed calls from Marigold. None. But there was something else. There was a notification from the picture-sharing app she used, the one I downloaded years ago because she said it would help us stay in touch, and when I tapped it, my own daughter's face filled the screen. She was on a beach. White sand, turquoise water, palm trees, a drink in her hand with a little umbrella in it, Trent beside her in sunglasses grinning, Bowden in the background building something out of sand. The caption underneath, in her cheerful, bouncy typing, said, "Mexico, finally! No work, no stress, no drama, just sun and family. We needed this so badly." The post had been put up 2 days ago. 2 days ago, while I was in surgery, while they were threading a wire into the artery near my heart and praying it would be enough. I stared at the picture. I scrolled down. There were comments from her friends. Have the best time. You guys deserve it. Send pics. I didn't cry. I think part of me was too tired to cry, and part of me had gone somewhere very still and very cold. I just turned the phone face down on the blanket and looked at the ceiling tiles for a long time. Romilly was reading her book again. After a while, she asked if I wanted some water. Yes, please, dear, I said. And Romilly? Yes, Mrs. Pemberton Whitlow. Connie, please. Just Connie. Connie, she said. She had a lovely smile, a little crooked on one side. Would you do me a favor and not tell anyone what I just saw on my phone? Not the doctor? Not the reverend? Not anyone? Just for now, just till I get my feet under me. She studied me for a second. Then she nodded. Of course, she said. Anything you need. I was in hospital 11 days altogether. 11 days, and Marigold called once. Once. On the 7th day, she'd flown back from Mexico and seen the messages, and her voice on the phone was bright and breezy and a little put out, the way it always was when something inconvenient had happened to me. Mom, oh my God, are you okay? I just got back. My phone died on the plane. I'm so sorry. Trent's parents had this whole thing planned and we couldn't really get a signal at the resort. Are you okay though? You sound okay. The doctor said you're stable, right? I let her talk. I listened to her excuses and I let her dig her own hole. And when she was finished, I said in the quietest voice I had, I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't worry about flying out. Just take care of yourself. She was relieved. I could hear it through the line, that little exhale. Oh, good. Mom's not going to make a thing out of this. Thanks, Mom. I love you. We'll come visit at Christmas, okay? I'll call you when we're back from Banff next month. Trent's parents booked us this whole package thing. Banff? Next month. They were going to Banff? Next month. They were going to Banff next month. That sounds lovely, I said. Have a wonderful time. I hung up the phone and I stared at the wall for an hour. Romilly came every day, every single day. She brought me a fresh nightgown from her own drawer because the hospital ones were rough on my skin. She brought me magazines and butterscotch hard candies and a little potted African violet with a yellow ribbon on the pot. She read to me when my eyes were too tired. She walked the hallway with me, slow loops, one hand always near my elbow, but never quite touching unless I needed her. She told me about her husband Wilfred, who'd been a high school music teacher and had died of pancreatic cancer fast and hard, 8 months from diagnosis to gone. She told me about her 2 grown children who lived in Halifax and Vancouver and called her every Sunday. She told me she'd started going to St. Mary's after Wilfred died because she needed somewhere to sit that wasn't her empty house. She wasn't trying to be my daughter. She was just being a person, a kind person. A person who saw another person hurting and decided to stay. When they discharged me, she drove me home in her little blue Honda. She helped me up to the condo. She made me tea and put a casserole in the freezer and changed the sheets on my bed and told me she was just down the road in the Williamsville neighborhood and to call her day or night if I needed anything, anything at all. I called her 2 days later and I asked her if she'd come for supper. She came. That was the start of it, I suppose. The new shape of things. Marigold did not come at Christmas. There was a snowstorm, she said. The flights were a nightmare. They'd reschedule for February. February came and went. She sent flowers on my birthday in March, with a card she'd had the florist write signed Love M, TNB. She called me on Mother's Day. The call lasted 9 minutes. She put Bowden on for the last 2, and he didn't know what to say to me because he barely knew me, his own grandmother, and I didn't know how to be easy with him because I'd been pushed so far out of his life. He was 9 years old. I hissed, held him in my arms in a Calgary hospital the day after he was born. I had not seen him in person since he was 4. Romilly came for Sunday dinner every week. We started doing the puzzles together, the big 1,000-piece ones on a folding table by the window. We started taking little day trips up to Westport and out to Wolf Island on the ferry. She introduced me to her book club and her walking group and a woman named Halberta from her old neighborhood, who became my friend too. My world, which had gone so small and so silent after Walter died, started to fill up again. And then, in late June, Marigold called. Not on a Sunday. Not on a holiday. On a Tuesday afternoon, 3:38, I remember exactly because I was just sitting down with my tea after my walk. Mum? Hi. How are you? Listen, I was just thinking Tret and I were chatting and we wanted to come out for a visit. Just us. Bowden's got camp. We thought maybe 2 weeks, mid-July. I didn't say anything for a moment. Mung? That would be lovely, sweetheart, I said. Great, great. And listen, while we're there, we should maybe sit down and talk about, just some practical stuff. Like, just to have on paper. Trent's mom had this whole thing where her affairs were a mess when she passed, and it took years to sort out, and we just thought, we should be proactive, just to take that off your plate. I was very quiet. Mum? What kind of practical stuff, dear? Oh, just, power of attorney type stuff, maybe getting your name on some joint accounts so we can help you manage things. Trent knows a guy who does this for his clients all the time. It's really straightforward. Just makes everything easier if anything ever. God forbid. God forbid. She hadn't picked up the phone when I was dying. 63 calls. Ronald had counted for me, later, going through the records. 63 calls and a beach in Mexico and no stress, no drama, and now my daughter wanted to put her name on my accounts and have me sign a power of attorney with a man Trent knew. That sounds like a lot to think about, I said. Why don't you come for the visit, and we can talk about it then? Perfect, she said. Perfect, Mom. I love you. I love you too, sweetheart. I hung up the phone and I sat with my cold tea for a long time. That night I called my lawyer. His name was Mr. Pendergast, and he'd done my and Walter's wills back in 2011, and he was an old badger of a man with white whiskers and a fondness for plain talk. I made an appointment for Thursday. I called Romilly and asked her to drive me because my hands had started shaking when I drove, and I didn't trust myself on the highway anymore. She didn't ask why. She just said, "What time, Connie?" I told Mr. Pendergast everything. I told him about the heart attack and the 63 calls and the beach in Mexico and the visit and the power of attorney and the joint accounts. He listened with his hands folded on his desk and his eyes getting harder and harder behind his glasses. When I was finished, he said, "Mrs. Burrs, Pemberton Whitlow, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Do not sign anything your daughter or her husband bring to you. Do not put her name on any account. Do not give her power of attorney. If she pressures you, you call me and I will speak to her directly. Do you understand?" "Yes," I said. "Now, what would you like to do about your will?" I'd been thinking about it for weeks, months really, ever since I'd come home from the hospital. I'd been thinking about it and pushing the thought away and thinking about it and pushing the thought away and thinking about it again. But sitting in Mr. Pendergast's office on that hot summer afternoon, with Romilly waiting for me out in the lobby with a magazine, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. "I want to leave the condo to Romilly Ashbury Croft," I said. "I want to leave the bulk of my savings, the TFSA, the RIF, and the GIC at TD, to my grandson Bowden in a trust that he can't access until he's 25 and that his parents can't touch. I want $25,000 to go to St. Mary's Parish. I want $10,000 each to go to the Heart and Stroke Foundation and to the Kingston General Hospital Cardiac Unit." I took a breath. "And I want $1 Canadian to go to my daughter, Marigold Pemberton Whitlow Hargrave." $1. Mr. Pendergast didn't blink. "That is your right," Mrs. Pendergast didn't blink. "That is your right. Pemberton Whitlow. I want it spelled out in the will. I want it said plainly, not buried in a clause. I want her to see it. I will draft it accordingly. And I want a letter," I said, "to go with the will, to be read after I'm gone. I want to say my piece." Of course. I didn't tell Romilly any of it, not the condo, not the trust, not the dollar. She wouldn't have wanted it. She would have argued with me, told me to think it over, told me she didn't need anything and didn't want anything. So I just kept it to myself, and I let her drive me home, and I made her supper that night. a roast chicken with the lemon and herbs the way Walter used to like it, and we ate at my little table by the window and watched the boats on the lake. Marigold and Trent came in mid-July, just like she'd said. They stayed at a hotel because Marigold said my condo was too small and she didn't want to put me out. They took me to dinner twice at a place that was much too expensive, and Trent ordered the wine and made a big show of paying. On the third evening, they came over with a folder of paperwork and a man named Devereaux Ashby Holcomb who did estate planning consulting, whatever that meant, and had teeth that were too white for his face. They sat in my living room and they spread the papers out on my coffee table. Devereaux walked me through it all in a voice that was much too smooth. The joint account, the power of attorney, a thing called a living trust that would let Marigold manage things on my behalf if I became incapacitated. Marigold sat beside me on the couch and held my hand, and Trent sat in Walter's old chair like he owned it. I let them talk. I let them get all the way to the end. Devereaux pulled a pen out of the inside pocket of his jacket and uncapped it and held it out to me with a smile. "All right, Constance," he said. "Where would you like to start?" I looked at the pen. I looked at Marigold's hand wrapped around mine. I looked at my daughter, and I tried to find in her face the little girl with the golden curls who had asked me once, very seriously, whether ladybugs went to heaven. I couldn't find her. She wasn't there anymore. Maybe she hadn't been for a long time. "I'm not going to sign these," I said. The room went very quiet. "Mum? I'm not going to sign them. Not today. Not next week. Not ever. I've spoken to my lawyer and he's advised me against it, and I agree with him. Mum, this is for your protection." "No, sweetheart," I said. "It isn't." Trent leaned forward. "Connie, look, we're trying to help you. You had a serious health event last year. You're in your 70s. We just want to make sure that if something happens, we're not scrambling around like Mum's family did when I had my heart attack last September," I said. "The hospital called my emergency contact 63 times over 3 days. 63. The voicemails told my emergency contact that I was in surgery, that I might not survive the night, that they needed someone to come. My emergency contact was on a beach in Mexico. My emergency contact didn't pick up. I want both of you to be very clear about something. I know exactly where I was, and I know exactly where you were, and I know exactly how many calls you ignored. I have screenshots. I have the hospital's phone records, which Mr. Pendergast subpoenaed. I have the photograph you posted with a timestamp. So when you sit in my living room and tell me you want to protect me, I want you to understand that I know what you're asking for, and I know why you're asking for it, and the answer is no." Marigold's mouth had fallen open. Devereaux Ashby Holcomb was very busy putting his pen back in his pocket. "Mum," Marigold said. Her voice had gone high and thin. "Mum, that's not fair. We didn't know. The signal at the resort, you told me on the phone that your phone died on the plane." "It did, but was it the plane or was it the resort, sweetheart? Because it can't have been both." She didn't answer. "I'd like all three of you to leave my home now," I said. "Mr. Ashby Holcomb, please take your folder. Trent, please get up out of my husband's chair. Marigold, I'm not going to call you for a while. If you need to reach me, you can write me a letter, like a grown woman." They left. Devereaux Ashby Holcomb practically ran. Trent slammed the door. Marigold stood in the hallway crying and saying, "Mum," over and over. And I closed the door gently in her face and locked it and went and sat down at my kitchen table. My hands were shaking. My chest was tight. For a moment I was frightened, not of her, but of my own body, of whether I was about to have another attack right there at the table. But I didn't. I sat. I breathed. After a while, I called Romilly, and she came over, and I told her everything. And she made me a pot of tea and held my hand across the table and didn't tell me I was right or wrong or anything at all. She just stayed. That was almost 2 years ago now. Marigold and I haven't spoken since. She wrote me one letter, a long one, full of accusations and apologies in equal measure, full of references to therapy and generational trauma, and how I had never really seen her, never really understood her. I read it twice. I put it in a drawer. I didn't write back. Trent's emails got nasty after a few months. They mentioned lawyers. Mr. Pendergast wrote them a letter that made them stop. I have not seen my grandson Bowden since he was 4. I don't know if I ever will again. That is the wound that won't close, no matter how much time goes by. That little boy is innocent in all of this, and he's being raised by people who taught him, by their own behavior, that grandmothers don't matter. I've left the bulk of what I have to him in trust, and Mr. Cotty, Pendergast, has my letter to him for when he's old enough, and I hope someday, when he's a man, he reads it and understands that I loved him from the first second I held him and never stopped. Romley and I went to Newfoundland last summer. She'd never been, and I'd been once with Walter 40 years ago. We drove the whole way, took 2 weeks, stopped at every lighthouse and lobster shack on the route. We drank tea on a wharf in Trinity Bay and watched the sun go down, and she said, "Connie, I'm so glad I sat in that hospital chair." And I said, "Romilly, my love, so am I. We're going to Prince Edward Island in August. Just the 2 of us. Honor and Halberta from the walking group are talking about renting a cottage with us next May. I started a watercolor class on Wednesday evenings. I joined the parish council at St. Mary's. I had my second cardiac follow-up last month, and the cardiologist said I had the heart of a 60-year-old, which is an improvement since I'm 73. The bells still ring at St. Mary's. I sit in the same pew. Sometimes I think about what I might have lost if I had died on that vestibule carpet. All the suppers and the puzzles and the ferries to Wolfe Island, all the laughing on the wharf in Trinity Bay, all the love that came running into my life from a woman who had no reason to give it. I would have died believing my daughter loved me. I would have left her everything. She would have spent it in 5 years and never once visited my grave. Instead, I lived. And in living, I got to find out who my real family was. It turns out family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's the woman with the paperback book in a hospital chair who didn't want you to wake up alone. Sometimes the silence of the people you bore tells you more than any words ever could. The phone rang 63 times. My daughter never picked up. And in that silence, I heard, finally, after 70 years of not wanting to hear it, the truth about who she was. I'm not bitter. I want to be clear about that. I'm not sitting in this condo brewing hatred. I forgave her in my own way the morning I signed the new will. Forgiveness isn't the same as letting someone back in. Forgiveness is just setting the weight down. I set it down. I picked up something else instead. Romilly's hand and a paintbrush and the leash of the little rescue terrier I adopted at Christmas, a scruffy thing named Biscuit who sleeps on my feet every night. If you're listening to this and you're somewhere around the age I was, and you're wondering whether the people in your life will show up when it counts, I want to tell you something. Pay attention to who's already showing up. Look around. There may be someone there you've been overlooking, someone quiet and steady, someone who isn't asking for anything. And there may be someone else, someone you've been pouring your love and your money and your hope into, who has already shown you in 1,000 small ways that they won't be there when the bells ring and your knees give out. Believe them. Both of them. Believe what they've shown you. It's not too late to change your will. It's not too late to change your life. I know. I did it at 71, and the best years of mine started after. I've thought about all of it a great deal in the years since, sitting at my kitchen table with my tea going cold, watching the boats on the lake. I've turned it over and over the way you'd turn a stone in your hand, looking at every face of it. What I've come to understand is this. Nothing happens in a single moment. The morning I went down on the vestibule carpet at St. Mary's, that was the day my daughter became someone who wouldn't pick up the phone. That was just the day I finally found out. Marigold had been showing me who she was for years before that. The 4-day visit when Walter died. The Christmases that became Easters that became Mother's Day phone calls. The grandson I hadn't held since he was 4. Every choice she made, every small turning away, was a brick laid in a wall. And I'd been so determined to believe it wasn't a wall that I kept handing her more bricks. The beach in Mexico wasn't an accident. It was the harvest of a crop she'd been planting for a decade, and I'd been the one watering it. That's the hardest part to sit with. And I think it's the part anyone in my position has to sit with eventually. We don't just receive what other people do to us. We participate in it by what we choose to ignore. I ignored a great deal. I called it love, but love isn't the same as looking away. The other thing I've come to know is that strength of character isn't what you show when life is easy. It's what you have left when life takes the floor out from under you. When I woke up in that hospital bed and saw what my daughter had done, the easiest thing in the world would have been to make excuses for her one more time. Sign the papers, hand over the accounts, keep the peace, even if the peace was killing me. I didn't do that, not because I was angry, but because I had finally run out of room to keep pretending. There's a kind of clarity that comes when you've been close enough to dying to feel the cold of it on your face. After that, you can't waste any more years on lies. What I want to say to anyone who's listened this far is that wisdom isn't something you're born with, and it isn't something that arrives all at once. It's something you build by being honest with yourself about who's actually in your life and who's only there for what you can give them. Goodness isn't measured by what you do for the people who love you back. It's measured by whether you can keep your dignity intact when someone you love has shown you they don't deserve the place you've given them. Romilly didn't owe me anything. She sat in that chair anyway. Marigold owed me everything. She sat on a beach. Both of those things told me the truth. And the truth, once you're brave enough to look at it straight on, is the kindest gift life ever gives you. It set me free at 71. It can set you free too, whatever age you're sitting at right now. One moment, I was standing at the bathroom sink, reaching for my blood pressure pills, and the next, I was on the tile floor, my right wrist bent the wrong way, staring up at the light fixture I'd been meaning to replace for 3 years. I didn't scream. I'm not sure why. Maybe because there was no one to hear it. I lay there for what felt like an hour, though my daughter told me later it was closer to 25 minutes, before I managed to drag myself to the hallway and reach my phone on the little table by the door. My wrist was useless, so I used my left hand. I called 911. I gave them my address. I said, I think I've broken my wrist and possibly my hip. I'm 67 years old and I live alone. And then I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and waited for the ambulance, and I thought, someone needs to call my son. That was the beginning of it. Or maybe the beginning was much earlier than that, and I just didn't want to see it. I've lived in the same house in Guelph for 31 years. My husband Harold and I bought it the year our son was born. It's a brick, semi-detached on a quiet street, the kind of street where people still wave from their driveways. Harold passed 9 years ago. A heart attack, quick, no warning, and after that I stayed, because the house still felt like him. The backyard garden was his. I learned to tend it myself. I kept things going. That's what I've always done. My son, I'll call him by what he always called himself, which was busy, moved to Calgary after he finished his MBA. He met a woman there, they married, they bought a house in a neighborhood where all the houses looked the same. I visited twice. He came back to Guelph at Christmas, most years. When Harold died, he stayed for a week and then flew home, and I understood that. He had a life. I didn't expect him to uproot it, but things shift slowly and you don't always notice until you're sitting on a cold bathroom floor waiting for an ambulance. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. They were kind. A young woman with red hair who kept calling me on, and a tall man who asked if he could call someone for me. I gave them my son's number. It was the only emergency contact I had listed. His name and his cell number, written in my handwriting on a card inside my wallet, the same card I'd updated every few years since Harold died. I was conscious in the ambulance. I remember the lights on the ceiling moving past, and I remember asking the red-haired paramedic if they'd reached my son. She said they were still trying. At the hospital, a nurse told me they had attempted to contact my emergency contact 14 times before I went in for surgery. 14. They'd left messages, they'd tried again, they'd asked me if there was anyone else. There was no one else. My sister lives in Nova Scotia. My friends from the neighborhood. Good women, real friends. didn't have the authority to consent to anything on my behalf, and I didn't have a healthcare directive in place. I'd been meaning to set one up. Harold's death had taught me I should, and still I put it off, the way you put off the things you can't bear to think about. I signed my own consent forms left-handed, which took 3 attempts, and then they wheeled me away. The surgery was for my hip. I'd broken my wrist, yes, but I'd also fractured my hip in the fall, which I hadn't felt because the wrist pain drowned everything else out. They did the repair that evening. I was under for about 2 hours. When I woke up, I asked the nurse if my son had called. He had not called. They'd tried a total of 22 times by the time I came out of recovery. I found that out the next morning from the patient services coordinator, a woman named, well, I'll just say she was patient and thorough and handed me a printed call log without me even asking for it. 22 attempts. Voicemails, the main line, the nurse's station, back to his cell again. I lay in that hospital bed in Guelph General and I thought, there has to be an explanation. He travels for work sometimes. Maybe he was on a flight. Maybe his phone had died. Maybe. And I caught myself building the scaffolding of excuses before I'd even run out of maybes. And I recognized that habit because I'd been practicing it for years. My neighbor Agatha, she's in her 70s. We've known each other since our boys were in school together. Came to the hospital the second morning. The nurses had called the non-emergency line for the city, and somehow, through a chain of phone calls I still don't fully understand, someone had reached Agatha because she is the kind of woman who always finds a way. She brought me a bag with my reading glasses, my phone charger, and a container of her butter tarts, which she knows I love. She sat in the chair beside my bed and held my left hand and didn't say anything about my son, which told me she already knew. I checked my own phone when I finally had it plugged in. I had 3 texts from my son, all sent the previous evening after I'd already been in surgery. The first said, saw I missed some calls. Everything okay? The second, about 40 minutes later, Mom? Call me when you get this. The third, the next morning, calling the hospital now. He called once, one time. The nurses put him through to my room. He asked if I was all right, and I said I'd had a fall, that my hip was fractured, that I'd had surgery. He said, "Oh, Mom." And then there was a pause, and he said, "I was at Jamie's place up at Sylvan Lake, and I didn't have cell service." I said, "For how long?" He said, "We drove up Friday afternoon. We got back Sunday evening." This happened on a Saturday. Your phone had no service the entire time? I asked. It's spotty up there. You know how it is. I didn't say what I was thinking. I said, okay. I said, I'm going to be here for a few more days. He said he would try to come out as soon as he could get away from work. He didn't come. He called 3 more times over the next 6 days. Each call was maybe 10 minutes. He asked about the physiotherapy schedule. He asked if I needed anything. He asked what the doctors had said about my recovery timeline. He was efficient about it, the way he's efficient about everything. He once told me that the key to staying on top of things is to treat every task the same, whether it's a client file or a personal errand. I remember nodding at the time. I remember thinking it was a reasonable philosophy. Sitting in a hospital bed with a fractured hip, I thought about it differently. Agatha came every day. She brought books. She brought food from my own fridge that she'd gone into my house to retrieve. She helped me call the physiotherapy clinic to set up my follow-up. On the 4th day, she sat with me while I called a home care coordinator because it was clear I wasn't going to be able to manage the stairs at my house alone for at least several weeks. It was Agatha who thought to ask the coordinator about the provincial home care subsidy. I hadn't even known it existed, and I would have paid out of pocket for everything if she hadn't been there. It was also Agatha who, on the 5th day, said quietly, he posted some photos, you know. Your son. His wife did, on her page, from the lake. I looked at her. I wasn't snooping, she said. My granddaughter follows her for some reason. She mentioned it. I asked Agatha to show me. The photos were posted on Saturday afternoon, around 4 o'clock. That was approximately 3 hours after I was taken into surgery. My daughter-in-law is one of those people who captions everything. The photos showed the 2 of them on a dock, drinks in hand, a long green stretch of Alberta Lake behind them. The caption said, "Perfect weekend, no agenda, no Wi-Fi, just us." A Hjorn. There were 47 comments. I handed Agatha back her phone and looked at the window for a while. No Wi-Fi. He had told me spotty cell service, but his wife had posted photos on Saturday afternoon, which required an internet connection, which meant there was service. Which meant, and I sat with this for a long time, which meant that 22 calls from a hospital in Ontario had gone to his phone and he had seen them and chosen not to answer. I want to be careful here because I don't know exactly what happened. I've told myself that many times. I don't know if he saw the calls and panicked and didn't know what to do. I don't know if he silenced the hospital number after the first attempt, thinking it was a mistake. I don't know what conversation happened on that dock before his wife posted those photos. I don't know, but I know that I was in surgery and he was on a dock and the caption said, "No agenda." I came home 11 days after the fall. The home care worker arrived 3 mornings a week. I did my exercises. I watched a lot of PBS and BBC programming that Harold would have enjoyed. My wrist healed faster than my hip. I got myself up and down the stairs slowly, holding the rail, counting to 3 before each step. My son called on the day I got home. He sounded relieved that I was out of hospital. He said he'd been meaning to come out, but things had been hectic. There was a presentation, there was a long weekend where they'd already made plans, there was always something. He said, "I'll get out there soon, Mom." "Maybe in the fall," I said. "That would be nice." I didn't tell him about the photos. I thought about it every day for 3 weeks. I turned it over the way you turn something over when you're looking for a way to set it down and be done with it. I wanted to find the interpretation that made it innocent. I tried. I genuinely tried. What I came back to every time was this: it is one thing to miss a call. It is one thing to be somewhere remote and unreachable. People go off the grid. I understand that. What I cannot make innocent is the choice, and it was a choice to not follow up. To see 22 missed calls from an unfamiliar Ontario number and think, "I'll get to it." To see a voicemail and leave it unlistened. To text your mother, "Everything okay?" and then go back to the dock. I have a will. I made it after Harold died with a lawyer on Woolwich Street whom Harold had trusted. It's a straightforward document. The house, the savings, the RRSP, divided equally between my son and a small list of charities Harold and I had given to over the years. I'd never thought seriously about changing it. It was the document of a woman who assumed, because she wanted to assume, that her son would be there when she needed him. In October, 4 months after the fall, I made an appointment with a different lawyer, a woman this time, sharp and efficient, who did not waste words. I told her what had happened. I told her about the calls, the photos, the doc. I told her about the 11 days in hospital and the physiotherapy visits and the home care and who had actually been there. I told her about Agatha. She listened. She asked a few questions. Then she said, "What would you like to do?" I told her I wanted to update the will. I wanted the house and the bulk of the savings redirected. There's a women's shelter in Guelph that Harold and I used to donate to every Christmas. There's a hospice care program that had helped a friend of mine through her last months with her husband. There's a bursary fund at the University of Guelph for mature students returning to school after illness or caregiving. I'd found it while I was recovering, reading through the university's community foundation page at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. I didn't know that fund existed either. There are things you don't know exist until you need them. I also set up a power of attorney document naming Agatha as my healthcare proxy. She cried a little when I told her. She said she was honored, and then she said, "You know you should have done this years ago." And I said, "I know," and we had tea. I did not tell my son I had updated the will. He called at Thanksgiving to say they'd decided to go skiing in Jasper instead of coming to Guelph for the long weekend. He called at Christmas to say they were doing a trip to Portugal with her family and wouldn't make it back. He sent a gift card, one of those general Visa ones, and a card that his wife had clearly chosen, with a watercolor of a cardinal on the front. He signed it with both their names in his handwriting. I spent Christmas with Agatha, her daughter, her son-in-law, and 3 grandchildren under the age of 8. It was loud and chaotic, and someone spilled cranberry sauce on the tablecloth and nobody cared. I ate too much and laughed more than I had in years. In January, I called a real estate agent. I want to be honest about this part because it's the part people find hard to understand when I tell it. They think I must have been angry, and I was, some of it. But mostly, I was clear. There's a difference. Anger is like weather. It moves through you. Clarity is something else. It settles. It makes decisions. My house was worth, and I say this as a practical matter, not a boast, considerably more than what Harold and I had paid for it. The Guelph market had done what it had done. The agent told me I could list it in the spring and likely have multiple offers within the first week. I thought about that. I thought about the garden Harold had planted, the apple tree in the back that still produced more apples than I could ever use, the wallpaper in the upstairs bathroom that I'd always meant to replace but had never been able to bring myself to touch because Harold had helped me hang it. I thought about all of it, and then I thought about a tile floor and 22 missed calls and a dock in Alberta and the word agenda. I listed the house in March. It sold in 6 days. I took a portion of the proceeds and bought a 2-bedroom condo in a building 10 minutes from Agatha, close to the physiotherapy clinic where I still do my weekly exercises, close to the library, close to a small cafe I'd become fond of during my recovery walks. The building has an elevator and a ground floor exit and a superintendent who is responsive, and a little garden area on the south side where tenants can grow things in raised beds. I claimed one of the beds in April. I planted tomatoes and sweet peas and the same variety of alpine strawberries Harold used to grow because I found the seeds at a nursery in Fergus and I took it as a sign. I used some of the remaining proceeds from the house to increase my charitable giving. The women's shelter, the hospice fund, the university bursary. I also made a donation to the Alzheimer's Society of Canada in Harold's name, something I'd been wanting to do for years and kept not getting around to. My son found out about the house sale through his aunt, my sister in Nova Scotia, who mentioned it in passing during a phone call. He called me that same evening. "Mom, why didn't you tell me you were selling the house?" "I didn't think you'd want to make a trip out," I said. There was a pause. "That's not, I would have wanted to know." "You know now," I said. He asked where I was living. I told him. He asked if I was all right. I said I was better than all right, actually. He asked if there was something wrong, if I was upset with him about something, and I said, we should probably have this conversation in person. He came in May, stayed at a hotel, which was fine. The condo only has the one guest room, and I'd quietly filled it with a good reading chair and a proper drafting table for the watercolor work I'd taken up during my recovery. He came for dinner the first evening, and we sat at my kitchen table, and I told him as plainly as I could what the fall had been like, the 22 calls, the surgery, Agatha, the photos on the dock. He didn't deny the photos. He didn't have an explanation for them that satisfied either of us, I think. He said he panicked, that he'd seen the calls and frozen, that he hadn't listened to the voicemails because he'd been afraid of what they'd say, and that by the time his wife had posted those photos, he was telling himself everything was probably fine. He said he knew it wasn't a good enough explanation. He was right about that. We talked for 2.5 hours. There were things said that hadn't been said in years, about Harold's death, about how I'd managed alone, about what he'd assumed I needed versus what I'd actually needed, about the distance that had grown between us in a way that neither of us had named, because naming it would have made it real. I don't want to make this tidy because it wasn't. I cried. He cried. Some of what he said made me angrier than I'd let myself feel in months, and some of what he said landed somewhere closer to grief. I did not tell him about the will. That is mine. What I do with my estate is my decision, and I made it with clear eyes and I'm at peace with it. What I told him was this: if something happens to me again, and I'm 67 and things happen, I need to know he will answer, not because he's obligated to. Not because I need him to fix anything, but because I will be alone in a hallway waiting and there needs to be someone who picks up the phone. He said he would. Whether that holds, I don't know. People make promises in emotional moments and then slip back into the lives they've built around being elsewhere. I've seen it. I've done it myself in smaller ways. I'm not naive, but I've also learned, and this is the part I want to say clearly in case someone listening is in the middle of their own version of this, that my life does not pause while I wait to find out. I planted tomatoes. I started painting again, badly at first and then less badly. I go for a walk every morning along the trail that runs beside the Speed River, and I stop at the same bench Agatha and I claimed as ours last summer, and I drink my coffee and watch the ducks, and it is genuinely, honestly good. I grieve the son I imagined I had. I do. He was a patient, attentive man in my imagination, the kind of person who drops everything when his mother's on the floor. The actual man is more complicated and less available and full of his own fears and failures, just like everyone else. I'm learning to see him that way, not as a disappointment, but as a person. It's slow work. It's the kind of work that doesn't have a finish line. What I no longer do is make myself smaller so he doesn't have to feel guilty about how much space he takes up. I don't swallow the things that need saying. I don't build scaffolding out of excuses that were never mine to build. I fell in my bathroom in Guelph on a Saturday in April, and I lay on the cold tile floor for 25 minutes, and the hospital called my son 22 times, and I had surgery alone, and I healed anyway. That's the whole of it. That's what I know. The sweet peas came up beautifully this year. Harold would have loved them. There's something you've been sitting with since all of this happened, and I want to try to say it clearly, because I think it matters beyond just my story. When I was lying on that bathroom floor in those first few minutes, I wasn't thinking about my will or my house or any of it. I was thinking, does anyone know I'm here? That's the question, stripped of everything else. Not, will someone help me? But does anyone know I exist in this moment? And the answer, it turned out, was one person did. Agatha, a woman I hadn't chosen as family but who had quietly become it over 30 years of borrowed eggs and shared grief and Wednesday afternoon walks. I think about what it took for Agatha to be the kind of person who shows up. It wasn't accident. She's someone who pays attention, genuinely pays attention, to the people around her. She notices, she remembers, she acts on what she notices, even when it's inconvenient, even when she has her own life pulling at her. That's not a personality trait you're born with. It's a choice made over and over in small moments until it becomes who you are. I watched her do it for decades without understanding what I was witnessing. And I think about my son and I try to be fair because fairness is something I owe both of us. He isn't a cruel person, but somewhere along the way, he stopped practicing the habit of paying attention. He got comfortable with distance, emotional distance, physical distance, and distance, left unchecked, becomes a kind of answer to every question before the question is even asked. The question was, my mother might need me. The answer his habits gave him was, she's probably fine. I'll check later. He didn't make that choice once. He'd been making it for years. The dock at Sylvan Lake was just the moment it became impossible to not see. What I've learned, and this is the part I couldn't have understood before the fall, is that the life I have now is a direct result of the choices I made while I was healing. Not just the practical ones, of dating the will, selling the house, finding the condo. The deeper choices, choosing to look at what had actually happened instead of the version of it I wanted to be true. Choosing to act on what I saw, even when acting meant grief. Choosing to build something rather than simply endure. Those choices took every bit of strength I had. I won't pretend otherwise. There were nights in that hospital bed where I lay awake and talked myself through it the same way I talked myself through each stair with the physiotherapy exercises. One step, then the next, then rest, then the next. Strength isn't the absence of fear or exhaustion. It's continuing anyway. I know that now in a way I didn't before. And here's what I want to say to anyone listening who is somewhere in the middle of their own version of this: the outcome of your life is not being decided by the person who let you down. It's being decided by you in the choices you make while you're still in pain. What you do with the clear-eyed version of the truth once you finally let yourself see it. That's the whole thing. That's what determines where you end up. Harold used to say that the garden teaches you patience whether you want to learn it or not. He was right. But I'd add this: the garden also teaches you that what grows is exactly what you planted and nothing more. The sweet peas came up because I put them in the ground. That's the whole of it. The champagne flutes caught the late afternoon light coming through the windows of the Fairmont ballroom, and I stood there holding mine, watching my son-in-law's father finish his toast, watching the smirk settle into his face like he'd already won something. He had no idea. 34 years. That's how long I'd been carrying what I knew about Reginald Ashworth Crane. 34 years of showing up to work at 6 in the morning, of eating toast for dinner so my daughter could have proper meals, of keeping a file folder locked in a fireproof box under my bed like some kind of sleeping grenade. I never thought I'd use it at a wedding. But there I was. My name is Maureen, and I've been a nurse for 38 years, the last 22 of them in palliative care at St. Joseph's in Hamilton, Ontario. I know what it looks like when someone is holding on to something they should have let go. I've sat with enough dying people to understand that. What I didn't know, not until my daughter was already engaged and the invitations already printed, was that the thing I'd been holding on to was about to become the most important decision of my life. Let me go back. It was 1991. I was 29 years old, newly married to a man named Dennis, working part-time at a medical clinic in Ancaster while Dennis worked construction. We weren't rich. We weren't anywhere close. But we were happy in the way young couples are happy when they don't know yet how fast things can change. Dennis worked for a company called Crane Pacific Infrastructure. They had contracts across southern Ontario, highway work, drainage systems, the kind of unglamorous projects that keep a province running. His foreman was a man named Gary Ashworth Crane, not the owner of the company. The owner was Gary's older brother, Reginald. But Gary ran the site in Stony Creek where Dennis was placed in the spring of that year. I remember the morning of April 14th the way you remember things that split your life in half. I was making oatmeal. Dennis had already left. The phone rang at 7:42. There had been a collapse. A retaining wall on the site had given way. 3 men were trapped. One was Dennis. By the time I got to the hospital, they had already brought him in. He had a broken pelvis, a fractured vertebra, and a traumatic brain injury. He survived. Barely, but he never came back to himself. He spent 4 months in hospital and then 2 years in a rehabilitation facility in Burlington. And by the time the insurance finally settled, by the time the lawyers and the company and the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board had finished their various dances, Dennis was in a long-term care home and I was 27 weeks pregnant with our daughter. The official finding was unexpected geological instability. Nobody was cited. Nobody was fined in any meaningful way. Crane Pacific paid a modest settlement and moved on. I signed the papers because I had no money for a lawyer and a baby coming and a husband who no longer knew my name. What I didn't sign away, because nobody asked me to, because nobody knew it existed, was a handwritten memo I'd found in Dennis's jacket pocket the week before the accident. He'd brought it home by accident, tucked it in with a grocery receipt, and left the jacket on the back of the kitchen chair. I'd washed it without thinking and then found the paper in the drum of the dryer, soft and faded but still readable. Dennis had pulled it out, looked at it, said, "Oh, I need to give that back to Gary," and then set it on the counter. He never did. He was in the hospital 3 days later. The memo was from Reginald Ashworth Crane to his site manager. It was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph discussed the retaining wall inspection that had been scheduled for the previous month. The second paragraph explained why it had been canceled, not because the inspector couldn't make it, but because Reginald had decided the cost wasn't justified for a short-term site. I read it 14 times standing in my kitchen with wet laundry at my feet. Then I put it in a Ziploc bag and locked it in the fireproof box. I want to explain something. People have asked me over the years, the few who knew any of this, why I didn't do something then, why I didn't take it to a lawyer or the newspapers or the Provincial Ministry of Labor. And the honest answer is that I was 29 years old, I was alone, I was about to give birth, my husband was in a facility, and I was terrified. Reginald Ashworth Crane's family was well connected in Hamilton. His brother-in-law was on city council. His company had lawyers on retainer. I had a memo in a Ziploc bag and no one in my corner, so I did what I could do. I went back to work. I had my daughter. I named her Faye, after my grandmother, and I raised her, mostly alone, visiting Dennis every Sunday until he passed away quietly in 2003. The same week Faye turned 11. She grew up knowing her father had been in an accident. She knew he'd been hurt at work. I told her when she was old enough to understand that there had been a company involved and that the company had not been held fully responsible. I didn't tell her which company. I didn't tell her about the memo. I told myself I was protecting her. I was probably protecting myself, too. Faye grew up to be extraordinary. I don't say that the way all mothers say it. I say it because it's demonstrably true. She got a scholarship to McMaster. She studied environmental law. She clerked for a judge in Toronto and then went into private practice, specializing in occupational health litigation. My daughter spent her career doing professionally what I had been unable to do personally. I thought that was enough. I thought maybe the universe had a sense of balance after all. Then she called me on a Tuesday evening in October and told me she'd met someone. His name was James. James Ashworth Crane. The name hit me like a physical thing. I actually sat down on the kitchen floor. Faye kept talking. She was happy. She was breathless, the way she only got when she was genuinely excited. And I sat there on the linoleum holding the phone and listening to her describe a man whose last name I had been saying in my head like a curse word for 30 years. I asked her, very carefully, if his family was in infrastructure. She said yes. She said his father was Reginald Ashworth Crane, that the family was well known in Hamilton, that James himself had nothing to do with the business. He was a high school teacher in Guelph. He deliberately separated himself from his father's company. He and Faye had met at a conference on environmental policy. I didn't sleep that night. I want to be honest about what I felt, because this story is not simple and I don't think it should be told simply. I felt rage, old, familiar rage that I'd learned to live alongside like a bad me. I felt fear. I felt something that wasn't quite grief, but was close to it. And underneath all of that, I felt something I didn't want to feel, relief. Because James Ashworth Crane was not his father. Every conversation I had with him over the following months confirmed that. He was kind. He was thoughtful. He was visibly uncomfortable when his family's wealth came up. He adored my daughter in a way that was quiet and certain and real. I kept my mouth shut. I kept my mouth shut when they got engaged. I kept my mouth shut when Faye came home one weekend glowing with the ring on her finger and told me the wedding would be at the Fairmont in Hamilton. In Hamilton, of all places, in Reginald Ashworth Crane's backyard. I kept my mouth shut through 14 months of planning, through the rehearsal dinner, through the morning of the wedding itself. What broke me was not Reginald. Not at first. It was Faye, the night before the wedding. She came to my hotel room. We both had a glass of wine, and she sat on the edge of my bed the way she used to sit when she was small, and something was bothering her. She said, "Mom, I need to tell you something. I've known for a while who Reginald is. I mean, what his company did to Dad." I went very still. She said she'd figured it out a year into dating James. She'd been doing discovery on an unrelated case, and Crane Pacific had come up in the documents. She'd recognized the name. She'd done her own research. She knew about the 1991 collapse, knew her father had been injured, knew the settlement. She said she hadn't told me because she was afraid I would ask her to end things with James. She said she loved James. She said James was not his father. "I know," I said. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "I'm sorry. I didn't say everything I was thinking." I said, "We'll talk after the wedding." And I meant it. I wasn't angry at her. I was something more complicated than angry, something that needed more time than one night to untangle. I kissed her forehead and I sent her to bed, and then I lay awake for 4 hours looking at the ceiling of my hotel room, and at 2 in the morning I got up, opened my suitcase, and took out the envelope I had brought with me from Hamilton. I had almost not brought it. "I'd heller you deceit, trust me," I hissed, and my kitchen 3 days earlier and thought, "Leave it. Let it be. Your daughter is happy. The man responsible is old now." What does it change? But I put it in my suitcase. Habit, maybe, or something I couldn't quite name. The wedding ceremony was beautiful. Faye was beautiful. James cried during his vows, which told me everything I needed to know about him. The reception was in the Fairmont Ballroom. Dinner at 6. Speeches at 7:30. Reginald Ashworth Crane gave his speech second after James's best man. He was in his early 70s, still straight-backed, still with that particular confidence of men who have never in their lives doubted their right to take up space. He spoke about his family's legacy, about how proud he was of James, about what it meant to him that this marriage was joining two good families. Two good families. He paused on that phrase. He looked out at the room and his eyes passed over me. I was at a round table near the back, seated with Faye's cousins and her friends from law school, not at the head table. And he said, "I understand that James's new mother-in-law is a nurse, a very admirable profession." He smiled. It's wonderful, really, when two families from different walks of life can come together. Different walks of life? He said it like a compliment. He delivered it like a compliment. Half the room didn't even notice. I noticed. The woman next to me, Faye's friend from law school, touched my arm. I don't know what was on my face. I set down my champagne glass. I thought about Dennis. I thought about the facility in Burlington. I thought about Faye sitting beside me at Sunday visits, coloring in a book while her father looked past us both, at something none of us could see. I thought about the grocery store where I worked evenings for 3 years to cover the gap between my nursing salary and our bills. I thought about the envelope in my evening bag. Reginald raised his glass. To James and Faye. The room lifted their glasses. I didn't. I stood up. In a room of 240 people, the act of one woman standing during a toast takes approximately 4 seconds to register. I counted them. Someone near the front noticed first. Then a ripple. Then the room was quieter than it had been, and I was standing at my table near the back with my hand resting on my chair and my evening bag in my other hand. I said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. I'd like to add something." Reginald looked at me. His expression was composed, polite, faintly annoyed. I said, "My name is Maureen Donnelly Walsh. I'm Faye's mother, and I've been waiting 34 years to say what I'm about to say, so I'll ask for a moment's patience." The room was silent. I opened my evening bag. I took out the envelope. I said, "On April 14th, 1991, my husband Dennis was injured in a retaining wall collapse at a Crane Pacific infrastructure site in Stony Creek. He sustained injuries that left him permanently disabled. He passed away in 2003. He never worked another day. He missed watching his daughter grow up." I heard a sound from the head table. "Faye!" I didn't look at her. The collapse was attributed to geological instability. No one was held responsible. I paused. What was not disclosed during the subsequent investigation was a memo written by Reginald Ashworth Crane to the site manager dated March 2, 1991. In that memo, Mr. Manager, Ashworth Crane canceled a scheduled structural inspection of the retaining wall, citing cost concerns. The silence in the room had a texture to it now. A wait. "I've had that memo for 34 years, I said. "I've sent copies this week to the Ontario Ministry of Labour, to the Hamilton Spectator, and to a lawyer who specializes in occupational health litigation." I looked at Reginald. "You built a legacy on something that cost my family everything. I didn't have the resources to fight you in 1991. I do now." Reginald's face had gone through 3 distinct phases. I watched the third one settle, something past anger, past composure, into something that looked, for the first time in the years I'd known his name, like fear. I said, "I have one more thing." I turned toward the head table, toward my daughter. "Faye, I am not angry at you. I understand why you were afraid to tell me. I've been afraid of my own silence for 30 years. We are the same in that way." I sat down. The room stayed quiet for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then James stood up from the head table. He walked across the ballroom, past the other tables, past the centerpieces, past his mother, who had her hand pressed over her mouth, and he crouched down beside my chair, and he said quietly, "I didn't know. I want you to know that I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. He took my hand, and he held it for a moment. Then he stood up and he said, in a voice the room could hear, "If what Maureen has said is accurate, and I have no reason to believe it isn't, then my father owes her an answer. And so do I." He looked at Faye. "I'm sorry, Faye. I'm sorry, this is part of our family." Faye came down from the head table and wrapped her arms around me and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. I won't pretend that the rest of the evening was easy. It wasn't. Reginald left within 20 minutes. His wife followed. A few of his business associates left quietly after that. There was a stretch of awkward rearrangement, music starting again, people finding their footing, the lovely wedding coordinator doing quiet, heroic work at the edges of the room. But the dancing happened. The cake was cut. James's best man gave a genuinely funny second toast about the time James had locked himself out of his car during a blizzard in Guelph and had to be rescued by a student. People laughed. Not everything was ruined. In the months that followed, Reginald's lawyer contacted my lawyer. The memo, combined with documentation from the original investigation that the Ministry of Labor agreed to reopen, led to a civil settlement. It wasn't a criminal proceeding. The statute of limitations had long passed. But there was a financial reckoning, and more importantly, there was a public one. The Hamilton Spectator ran 3 articles. The ministry issued a statement. A union that had been advocating for injured workers in similar situations reached out and asked if I would speak. I said yes. James and Faye bought a house in Hamilton, a small brick semi on a street with old maples that drop leaves in October like they have something important to say. I go for dinner on Sundays. Their daughter, my granddaughter, who arrived the following spring and was named after no one in particular, but chose the world with considerable determination, has Dennis's eyes. Same shape, same light brown. I noticed it the first time I held her, and I didn't say anything. And then when I got to my car, I sat in the parking lot of the hospital and cried for 20 minutes. Good crying. The kind that's been waiting a long time. I kept the original memo. Not in the fireproof box anymore. It's in a frame now, in my study, next to a photograph of Dennis from before the accident. He's laughing in the photo. He's got paint on his jeans. He looks like himself. People tell me they can't believe I waited 34 years. They ask me if I regret not acting sooner. I understand the question. The answer is complicated. I regret every year Dennis spent in that facility. I regret every Sunday visit that Faye sat quietly beside me because she didn't know what to say to a father who wasn't quite there. I regret that justice, when it came too late to matter to him. But I don't regret where I was standing that evening in the Fairmont Ballroom, or what I said, or the look on Reginald Ashworth Crane's face when he understood, finally, after 34 years, that some things don't stay buried just because you paid to have them covered over. You can cancel the inspection. You can settle the claim. You can give a toast at your son's wedding about different walks of life and feel like you've gotten away with something. But somewhere in a hotel room in an evening bag, there is a woman who has been quiet long enough, and the champagne flutes are catching the light, and she is standing up. People sometimes ask me if I feel guilty about what I did. Standing up in the middle of my daughter's wedding reception and saying what I said, in that room, in front of all those people, and I've sat with that question long enough to answer it honestly. No, I don't feel guilty. But I did feel afraid for about 4 seconds right before I stood up. And then something in me went very quiet and very clear, the way it sometimes does in the middle of a difficult night shift when everything narrows down to what needs to happen next. I've thought a lot about why it happened the way it did. Why that room, that night, after 34 years of saying nothing. I don't think it was an accident. I think there's a kind of logic to the way things unfold when a person has been carrying something for a very long time. Not a mystical logic, just a human one. Reginald spent decades building a reputation on top of a decision that cost my family everything. And I spent those same decades becoming someone who knew exactly what that decision had cost. By the time we were both standing in that ballroom, the weight was never going to stay hidden. It was only ever a question of when. What I know about Dennis is that he was not a careful man in the way that cautious people are careful. He trusted that the people responsible for his safety were doing their jobs. That's not naivety. That's the basic agreement you make when you go to work every morning. Reginald broke that agreement to save money on an inspection. And the consequence of that choice rippled outward for 34 years in ways he never had to witness because he was never in the same room as the damage. That's what I kept thinking about while I was sitting at that table. Not anger exactly. Something more like clarity. He had never once had to sit across from what he'd done. I had lived inside it. I think that's what people sometimes misunderstand about situations like mine. They think the hard part is finding the courage to speak. But the harder part is the waiting, the years of making a decision every single morning to get up and keep going when the thing that hurt you was never acknowledged and never punished. That takes a different kind of strength than courage. It takes a stubborn, quiet insistence on your own dignity, even when nobody around you is reinforcing it. Faye became the person she is, the lawyer, the advocate, the woman who chose a partner with genuine kindness in him, because she grew up watching me make those daily decisions. I didn't lecture her about integrity. I just paid the bills and showed up for work and visited her father every Sunday and didn't let bitterness make me smaller. Children learn what they live alongside. And James, who knew nothing of any of this, who crossed that ballroom floor and took my hand and said I didn't know, is not a footnote to this story. He's part of what I got to keep. You don't choose your family's history. You choose what you do with it. What I'd say to anyone carrying something similar is this: the weight doesn't get lighter by pretending it isn't there. And silence, sustained long enough, has a cost of its own, not because speaking up is always possible or always safe, but because carrying alone, indefinitely, hollows you out in ways you sometimes don't notice until you're sitting in a parking lot crying in a way that's been waiting years to happen. I sat in that parking lot outside the hospital the day I first held my granddaughter. I cried for 20 minutes, and then I drove home. That's the whole story, really. You carry what you carry, you find the moment, and then you drive home.